Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Glick. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about a subject that kind of sort of hits close to home, but not as bad as it affects a lot of people, and that's mental illness. Before we start talking tonight, as always, if you're watching this on YouTube or any other platform, please take the time to like and subscribe, share the video on social media, put your comments on the video, give me a chance to respond to you and correspond with you back and forth. I love the dialogue. But if you see this on any other platform that does not have a textual context, in other words, there is a description of this video that should be attached to this context, at this podcast. If it is not, please do feel free to visit either monspiracy.podbean.com, which is where this podcast originates, or go to YouTube where the content will be there. Now, as I have said many times in the past, Montana takes advantage of things that occur on a national level. They aren't individually responsible, but they take advantage of a circumstance that's happening on a national scale to profit themselves and to profitize the prison system and their own empowerment through the money they receive. Now, mental health used to be a clinical issue. It used to be an issue dealing with medical. People had a mental illness, they were committed to a mental health facility, or they received mental health care. Now it's become a criminal issue in the United States. In fact, it could be argued that the criminal justice system has criminalized, or the American justice system, I should say, has criminalized being mentally ill. This particular national crisis is something that the Great Montana Conspiracy capitalizes on. In far more cases than not, being mentally ill is a crime in the United States. No one would go so flagrant as to say mental illness is a crime. But mentally ill individuals are targeted for their illnesses and taken advantage of because of their illnesses within the criminal justice system, and no more so than Montana. Mentally ill individuals are often less competent, and that means they have less capacity to defend themselves. They become easy targets, easy prey for predators within the criminal justice system to simply have a body to fill a bed. And of course, the prison system requires bodies to be in the bed to receive the federal block grants. Attempts at self-defense of people who are mentally challenged often are seen as deranged and incompetent, easily dismissed. Signs that should be seen as cries for help are instead predatorized by the prosecutors and the judges. They are seen as an opportunity and a weakness that they can exploit, and oftentimes that becomes the issue: exploitation. Remember, as I've reported on before, prosecutors and judges look for easy marks to throw into prison. The prison system must be filled before they can claim beds and occupancy to the federal government to receive the criminal justice block grants in many cases. The prison for profit system requires bodies, physical bodies, to be in prison. They're certainly not going to fill those beds with their elite comrades in arms or their businessmen who bring money into their campaigns, or even fellow politicians. They're going to use their own little weak members of society, those who are less capable of fighting back, to fill those beds and to empower them, to give them money. And just as an point, by saying comrade in arms, I'm not giving a sly reference to communism. I'm not trying to accuse anybody of being a communist or anything like that. I'm simply saying comrade in arms because they're collaborators, they're conspirators, they're comrades in arms. They're people who work together towards a common goal, and this is their own self-empowerment, their own elitism, their own kickbacks and financial benefits they receive, and social impacts they receive from their positions of power and authority, which they are obviously abusing. Now, we have issues here that are going to become very, very prominent and can actually be somewhat disturbing. And I want to apologize in advance if anybody finds descriptions of some of the things I'm talking about tonight to be that way. Basically put, the United States has a horrid history, an absolute horrid history with treating their mentally ill. And when you talk about some of these things that have been done, it becomes really disturbing to think that we would do this to anybody. where they're not so different from the Nazis and the concentration camps and the experiments perpetuated upon helpless Jewish prisoners. The idea here is that as we proceed, we have to understand that this is historically true and accurate. It's not meant to, in any way, minimize or deflect away from the subject at hand. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. The criminal justice system, as I said, they target the poor. The poor are usually the uneducated and the lack of legal background who know they even have a right to fight back, much less the capacity to fight back. They lack resources to hire proper legal defense and often are given no choice but to rely upon a vastly overwhelmed public defender system. This represents the vast majority of individuals who are convicted of crimes. Add to it the incapacity to understand what's going on around you because of a mental illness. It makes for it's a ready-made convict. It's like they're manufactured, they come out of a factory ready to go to be inmates as far as these corrupt officials are concerned. Statistically speaking, an individual who is mentally ill is 16 times more likely to be shot and killed by a police officer confronting them in public. They're more often to be tased, they're more often to be threatened, and of course, when threatened, a mentally ill person oftentimes misperceives and misjudges the circumstance and will resist, or will try to flee, or will try to commit some other act that to a normal person is considered a criminal act. Consequences. It makes them easy prey for law enforcement, it makes them easy prey for prosecutors, it makes them easy prey for courts. This all started in the U.S. back in the 1960s. This was not something that happened overnight. It's not something that happened uniquely in Montana. It started with the United States federal system and the attempt to look into what were clear abuses within the mental institution system, from the asylum system that existed in many states. Historically, as I said, the U.S. has a horrid history here. Absolutely horrid. There's just no defending in this. And as I said, I liken it to the Nazi camps of Germany. Individuals who are committed to asylums are oftentimes given literally lifetime commitments. They are basically locked away, lost and forgotten, and committed for life to these institutions. They don't have the ability to plead their own cases. They have no ability to even understand what's going on with them in many cases. Once within the walls of an institution, whether it be a state hospital, an asylum, or whatever term you want to use, patients became frequently abused, they were mistreated and neglected, and just like in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, they were experimented on. They were experimented on and they were killed in the process of many of these experiments. They were treated like guinea pigs. That's the only way to describe it. They were treated like guinea pigs. More experiments were conducted on asylum residents than any other group at the time. More than prison inmates, more than the public. These were the people who were considered to be helpless, without rights, and no capacity to complain about the treatment they were receiving. Some of these experiments included injecting cancer cells into healthy patients to study the effects, deliberately giving hepatitis to patients to test serums, squirting pandemic flu viruses up the noses of patients, tests of lobotomies, scrambling the brains to see the effects that has on personality. And then there's the whole, we even had sexual assaults on inmates to these mental health facilities. And in many cases, of course, a lot of these were homosexual assaults, male on male. But often, and in some reported cases, actually instances where the staff were encouraged to have sex with the female inmates to make them pregnant so their fetuses could be aborted and tested. I mean, that's horrid. It's a horrid concept and an idea. And of course, this brings up the obvious physical and sexual abuses that these patients had to endure. And remember, these were lifetime commitments. They didn't have an advocate on the inside 99% of the time. They didn't have any voice on the outside. They are oftentimes cut off from their families. What happened within the walls, if they spoke up or tried to pass along the information that was going on, they were punished. They were retaliated against because they literally lost all their rights once their mental health diagnosis was made. Not that they legally lost their rights, They still have their rights. Facilities would not honor them. They would treat them like just cattle. They were not people. It was horrid. It was a horrid period of our time. Oftentimes these commitments meant little more than just being locked in a basement or a large room, what they called community rooms, with a couple of beds lining the walls. I mean, they oftentimes literally had no proper sanitation. They certainly didn't have proper cleaning or hygiene. In many cases, they were just simply, thrown into a room and given food and allowed to just do whatever they wanted to do for great periods of time. That's just some of the states of our mental health facilities in the United States, as recently as the 1950s and 1960s. Disease was allowed to spread for both the amusement of the staff and for research. Rarely received adequate care. They didn't receive the adequate medical care that they needed. They didn't receive the medications. And the medications they did receive oftentimes were designed to do nothing more than just stone them or just make them, zombies. Walk around with absolutely no mental capacity, no emotional capacity, just a blank slate, easily manipulated, easily dealt with and managed. They didn't care if this was actually treating a mental disease. These are just people that they didn't want to have to deal with. And so they doped them up to the point they couldn't even really understand what was being done to them or anything that was being done to them. In response to reports of this kind, the U.S. Congress passed a law in 1955. It was called the Mental Health Study Act. It led to the establishment of something called the Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Mental Health. The commission issued a report in 1961. It reported these conditions and some of these issues. Many of these atrocities remained unreported even until recent times because the states bury these records. But many reports of lifetime institutionalization and the overburdening costs upon the institutions in the states, of course, a politicized ideal. And it's not a cheap thing to house people for the rest of their lives, so it was to a certain degree accurate. There were alternatives, but the idea was, okay, let's do away with, this was the report recommended, let's do away with statewide institutionalizations, the isolation of mentally ill. Let's put them in the community. Let's start transitioning into community-based care programs. It led to the passage of what was called the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, or the CMHA. On the surface, the CMHA looked like a really good and progressive act. It was taking people who were isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, subjected in many cases to abuse and neglect, and transitioning into a community where they could once again become productive citizens. It removed people essentially committed to a lifetime imprisonment inside mental facilities and worked toward reintegrating them back into their own communities. This was called deinstitutionalization. It's a really long word, and I get tongue-tied saying it a lot. The idea was not to isolate the mentally ill, but to make them productive members of society. It was a great philosophy, it was a great idea. It promised great leaps towards community-based support networks. The problem is, the CMHA's much vaunted proposals never really materialized. The CMHA promised to provide community health centers and research facilities in the states by giving the states funding to create to build these community-based programs, to fund them, to staff them, and to make them available for the mentally challenged. The idea was that with community-based programs, state hospitals and asylums would be unnecessary. States loved the idea because it meant they didn't have to spend money supporting the state mental hospitals. Almost immediately, states began deinstitutionalizing their patients. They reduced the patient population. Since the passing of the CMHA, over 90% of state mental health hospitals' beds have been reduced. We're at less than 10% of the population as they once were. The anticipation for community services was so strong that the states simply believed they were coming, so let's just deinstitutionalize now and get it out of the way. They didn't wait for the end product. They just started immediately saying, okay, we're going to get this funding, we're going to get all this money, we're going to be able to do this. let's deinstitutionalize now to create an impetus for this in the communities, and we can stop worrying about funding the state institutions. This was far too premature, since there was no real support system yet. Nothing existed yet. It was all in theory. It was all in funding, limited funding, by the way, but it was in a funding stage. It wasn't in an application stage. There was no community-based programs to receive these discharged patients. Worse, only half of the facilities ever funded were ever built. And the ones that were built were not properly funded. The states, who the federal Congress had presumed was going to take the money that they had been using on the state hospitals and help make up the difference, chose not to redirect the money that way. They simply took the money that they saved from funding the state hospital and put it into other projects and didn't refund the community-based programs. They left it up to the federal government, which didn't provide enough to fund the programs on their own, which left an incredibly difficult system to where you had a community-based program that most of the facilities weren't built, less than 50%, and even the ones that were built didn't have the money to fund themselves, and they ended up closing. This meant that patients were thrown out not only of the state-run institutions, but also the community-based institutions. Most of them need viable support. Families didn't know how to take care of them. The community certainly didn't know how to take care of them. They often ended up homeless, without shelter, without medical help, without medical care. The few that did remain within mental facilities, they were fine. The states came in and started with less demand upon them. They were able to get more attention. Honestly, it appears from current reports that state facilities are much more engendered towards treating mentally ill fairly. But it's a significantly reduced capacity. Mental illness did not vanish. The need for mental illness and mental health funding did not just vanish because Congress passed a new bill. In fact, the bill didn't even meet the demands that it was set out to do. The last remaining funding for the CMHA was redirected under Ronald Reagan to community block grants. So it was non-specific funding that did not require supportive health facilities. So the states can now receive as a block grant that did not target supporting the community-based programs that the CMHA was designed to create, which means inherently it just got redirected wherever the individual states felt like directing it, because it was a block grant now and not a targeted grant. And essentially the states could apply it for whatever they wanted, without any dedicated purpose or spending as required as under the original CMHA. The problem is this coordinated hand in hand with something else I've reported on quite extensively, and that's the prison for profit system. As the state hospitals shut down, the prison for profit system was just getting started. Deinstitutionalization occurred between 1963 to the late 1980s. 1984 saw the first modern prison for profit model erected. That was when the first private company actually got control of a state-run facility. Corrections Corporation of America was awarded the contract to run the Shelby County facility in Tennessee. The federal government had begun in 1968 to create the Justice System Block Grants with the Omnibus Crime Control Safe Streets Act. So here we are in 1963 with deinstitutionalization, and 1968 we start to award grants to the communities and to the states to house and be more aggressive on crime. So you've got people being released from mental institutions who oftentimes are unable to control their conduct, are oftentimes unable to understand what's going on around them, or to properly interpret the intent of others, who are seen by society as a problem, as being criminals, as being unstable, and a risk to public safety. And what happens when you have people who are a risk to public safety? They go to jail. Without a proper mental health system in place, these people who were becoming deinstitutionalized were instead being reinstitutionalized in the jail and prison systems. And the federal government was starting to fund the state prison systems in the auspice of creating
safer streets, to create less crime. They created a crime problem and then funded housing more criminals. It was like this, it almost looks like it was ready-made. Like, okay, we're going to pass this law, we're going to wait 5 years. And in 5 years, we're going to pass another law where we're going to take these people that we've deinstitutionalized and start throwing them into prison. And they're still going to be off the streets. We're just going to call them criminals instead of mentally challenged or mentally ill, or whatever term they wanted to apply at the time. As mental patients began to be discharged, again, they were seen as a threat to public safety. Mental health, so-called insanity pleas, were oftentimes the only hope that an individual with mental illness had. But without a state-run hospital, there was no place else for judges to send these people. So once again, as mental patients are becoming discharged, they were seen as a threat to the safety of society. And as a consequence, when they went to the legal system, as they were picked up and arrested for these various crimes they were committing, they were being sent to the jails and the prisons instead of to the mental hospitals, because the mental hospitals no longer pretty much existed as they had once done. Mental health and so-called insanity pleas were being made, but they were being rejected by judges more and more, influenced by both the public perception of a risk to society and the desire to be tough on crime. Little effort was made to understand the cause behind the increase in criminal acts, and the mental health defense that was no longer an adequate resource to exist. The only place to put them outside the public safety network, or in public safety in the community, was the prison system. Montana became 1 in 4 states that abolished the insanity defense entirely, i.e. the not guilty by reason of insanity. They eliminated it in 1979, 7 years after they incorporated it in the Constitution in 1972. Montana replaced it with the 3 mental health categories. They called guilty but mentally ill, not guilty due to mental illness, and unfit to proceed to trial. These are essentially the 3 qualifications you can get if you are found to be suffering from mental illness. The problem is that the law has given the sole discretion of this to the judges. The judges get to decide for themselves. They don't have to follow the recommendations of a psychiatrist or the testimony of anyone. They don't want to accept this issue. They don't have to. The law says it's their discretion. In fact, MCA Montana Code Annotated Section 4614.221, paragraph 1, specifically requires the determination of mental illness by the court. It's not a mandatory issue. The only thing that's mandatory is the court must be the one to make the choice. It doesn't say that they have to follow a psychiatric recommendation or anything else, any evidence or suggestion or anything. It just says that the court must decide. The court may adopt, may not adopt. So a person with no medical or psychological background or training gets to decide the mental competency of a defendant. And it's so often the case is judges simply don't care. They don't, let's face it, they don't care. They want people in prison because the people who are in prison are the ones who fund their prison for profit system. People who are committed to mental health facilities, that's an incredibly underfunded aspect of government, and it's not where they get their money from. So where are you going to get your money from if you're not putting people in prison beds? Let's face it, that's what the motivation is for these people. Let's be tough on crime, let's show our constituents we're tough on crime, let's put as many people in jail as we possibly can. And let's face it, even victims of these crimes, even victims of people who are suffering from mental illness don't want to be sympathetic to the person who assaulted them, hurt them, stolen from them, whatever. They don't want to be sympathetic to somebody and say, well, the person gets off because they're mentally ill. They're mentally ill. They cannot be accountable for their conduct, and the state system has faltered and failed them. And yet here we are with a system that's designed, ready-made to throw them into prison. The judges want to listen to their constituents who are going to vote for them. Mind you, in a system where they actually have people run against them, as I've said many times in Fayette County, no one ever runs against the entrenched judges. No one runs against the person who's already in office. It's a lifetime appointment, essentially. So, presumably, the idea is that you're going to want to still build your jacket if you have ambitions to go beyond your current position, like a municipal court justice will want to become a justice court justice. The justice court will want to become a district court judge. The district court judge will want to be a Supreme Court justice and or move into Secretary of State or possibly a governorship or possibly even a federal position. Even federal appointment into an actual lifetime appointment in the federal system of judiciary. So they're always going to want to demonstrate that they are tough on crime. So that's where the model of judgments come from. Not, is there an excuse for this conduct, but can I put a person in prison? Can I build up my reputation in my own jacket? Can I build up my successful prosecution, lack of prosecution, my successful conviction jacket to show my skills and my talent and my ability to use this position to actually be tough on crime. Those are the kind of credentials that get you into the spotlight. Those are not the, I'm going to go ahead and look at the situation and I'm going to make the best judgment that's fit for everybody involved. Too many times they're after their own careers. When they're after their own careers, forget about whether they do the right thing, because they're more interested in themselves than they are in the people before them. And these people don't make any mistakes. These people literally have the ability to destroy your life. They can obliterate you in a heartbeat. Not because you did anything wrong, because they don't want to care. And they're not bound to care. And in this case, they're not even bound to actually make a decision that matches or even corresponds with even psychiatric evaluation. If given the choice between essentially forgiveness or punishment, in this kind of situation, where do you think the judge is going to lie? You think the judge is going to say, let's forgive him, let's give him a mental health commitment, let's give him some care, let's get him treated, let's get him to where he's a more confident and reasonable individual? Oh. Let's put this person in prison and away from society where he can't hurt anyone again. It doesn't matter whether the person actually needs prison or the person needs mental health or medical care. And I've testified to many times, the Montana medical system falls woefully short of adequate care. I don't know where their funding comes from for medical. They certainly are not using it to actually treat anybody. Not within, I mean, it's all this modicum, possibility. I suffer from a chronic joint pain disease called rheumatoid bearing disease. In my entire time in the prison system, I never once received adequate care. Not once. I was forced to suffer. I had no prescription medications. I had no rehabilitation. I had no physical rehabilitation to allow for the lack of degeneration of my joints, or the lack of the pain overcoming me where I became debilitated, unable to move. It took me years after coming out of prison where I was actually able to physically be able to start doing things actively again, because it just took me that long to build up my strength. So the system falls woefully short. And while they have mental health counselors and they have doctors and you can fly a kite or a request to see a medical doctor they don't really, it's all smoke and mirrors, it's all a pony show. They don't care if they actually are treating anybody. They're just there to offer the pretense and the perception that they have medical care. So the care that's received is not adequate, not even close. And that most especially applies towards mentally health challenged individuals. The truth is, everything beyond the examination when it comes to the courts is discretionary. It becomes discretionary because the law doesn't require a judge to actually say, this is what I have to do. I may do it. The only thing he has to do is if the mental health defense is raised, they have to order an examination. Then once the examination gets resubmitted to the court may or may not. The language of the law reads, if the court determines, or the court may. It doesn't say things like, if the examination determines, the court must, which is what it should say. If the examination determines the individual suffers from mental illness, this is what the court must do. That's not what the law says. The law says, if the court decides or determines that there is a mental illness, the court must decide. As I said, MCA section 4614-221, paragraph 1 specifically requires the court to make the determination, not the psychiatric professional, not a medical professional. No one with any medical background whatsoever gets to make the decision. He doesn't have to listen to the medical report. There's nothing in the law that requires him to. And oftentimes, in many cases, they don't. They don't listen to it. They don't care. They don't want to care. And in fact, I've seen judges I've seen at least 2 judges in my time in the courts reject a request for medical review. There was one time in Flathead County when I was in the courtroom, waiting for one hearing or another, and Judge Ted Lippis was on the bench. And the defense said, Your Honor, we moved to have a medical examination, a psychiatric evaluation, because I don't believe my client is competent. And Lippis actually came out and said, it's not his job to cater to a defendant's desire to waste his time. He wasn't going to. He didn't have to. It wasn't his job. So the law requires that once it's raised, the judge must call for an examination. And that was an instance where I witnessed Judge Ted Lippis. He's deceased now, so there's not a whole lot I can do to beyond that. But it was back in 2004 when I was actually in the court system, 2004, 2005, when I was making infrequent trips into the courtroom and witnessing other people's cases. So at that time, he was on the bench. And I witnessed him say this to a defense attorney, that he didn't have to cater to this defendant's wasting his time. The law requires him to do this, but he didn't do it because he didn't want to. Then there was an instance when I was in prison, where I was told about another story by an individual. His name was Roman, and I don't remember his last name at the moment, but he told me about a time he went to court, and he didn't have an attorney, because in his mentally unstable state of mind, he dismissed his attorney because his attorney was working against him, which probably isn't far from the truth there, because my attorney worked against me, and I know for a fact. But he dismissed his attorney, and then just proceeded to show up to a hearing to defend himself against an assault charge. His little defense, he had brought some salt packets he gathered them up from the lunch and dinner trays and brought them to the courtroom. And his little defense to the judge is, you want to accuse me of assault? You walked over to the prosecutor and threw a salt packet and said, here's assault. Here's another assault. Here's another assault. Throwing salt packets. And the court clearly was recognizing mental illness. Did nothing, still found him guilty of the assault charge. Because, obviously, I don't want to give this guy, this guy's sitting here throwing salt packets at the prosecutor. Come on. What kind of competent person who does not suffer from a mental illness would be doing this? And yet, he was found guilty of the assault charge because he didn't have a competent defense. Well, that's your defense. So be it. If the court determines, or the court may do this, it means the court doesn't have to. There's nothing in the law that says they do. And even when the law says they have to, in Montana, that doesn't mean anything. Now mind you, even if the court makes the proper determination, even if they say, yes, there's a mental health issue here, they're only required to remand them into the Department of Health and Human Services custody. but the state resources are woefully deficient to house mentally ill criminal defendants. Remember, states, including Montana, have consistently underfunded mental health facilities for decades. So if there is no bed available, the defendant still stays in the prison system until one is available. If ever, the defendant can oftentimes, and will oftentimes, serve out their entire sentence inside the prison waiting for a bed to be opened. Now, whether this is because no beds are actually being opened, whether other cases are being prioritized, or whether they simply get lost in the shuffle, who knows. But I've served in prison. I spent 5 years in the prison system of Montana. 22 months in the jail system, and then the remaining time in the actual state prison system. I have seen hundreds of people who suffer from mental illness in the prison system. I was a cellmate with one. He would wake me up frequently in the middle of the night talking about unicorns or one other hallucination or another. I remember one time specifically, he woke me up, hey, look, I got the unicorn on my chest. You can look at it right now, you can see it, just get up here, look. Because in his mind, he was seeing all these imaginary creatures and all these imaginary things happening around him. And this is an example of someone who's completely untreated inside the prison system. I helped somebody as a legal beagle inside the system. I helped somebody who literally was there because his meds had stopped working. And he saw an old lady transform into a demon and attack him. And he thought he was defending himself. And yet he was in prison. Not in a mental health facility, in prison. Now, just for anybody who doesn't understand, a lot of times people with hallucination issues or dealing with bipolar issues or dealing with schizophrenia, meds only work for a short time before the body starts to adjust to them and acclimate to them and they stop working. People think, oh, they just keep taking their meds. They can still keep taking their meds. The meds become less and less effective. They have to be adjusted over time. So they can be religiously taking their meds, but because of their mental illness, they're unaware that the meds are not working as effective as they once were. They think they're fine, they're complacent, they become feeling safe in their life, and then they have an episode. Completely unaware that an episode is going to happen, it happens. They lose touch with reality, regardless of whether it be as the gentleman who perceived an old lady transforming into a demon, or they start being unable to take care of themselves, or they feel threatened and paranoid, or whatever the manifestation of their mental illness is. It oftentimes isn't their fault. Quite a lot of the time, it's because their meds simply stop working. And nobody recognizes it. They don't know to report to the medical care provider because they're not recognizing that the symptoms are reappearing, because to them, what they see is very real. They don't understand that their perceptions of reality have started to falter, they've started to slip, they've started to become disjointed. And because of that, it ends up being a problem because they can't report to their healthcare provider that their meds aren't working anymore, and their healthcare provider therefore is uninformed that the meds have stopped working. It's not a systematic clock. Like, okay, this will work for 2 months, and this will work for 18 months, and this will work for 3 years. Everybody's response, and sometimes the meds don't even work. They'll prescribe the medication, it does not change the symptoms, and so they have to keep shuffling around until they find a combination that will work. That's the process of mental health treatment. Trying to find medications that will work, and that will consistently work, and to adapt when the meds stop working. And they do stop working. But the problem is, what happens, they end up in front of a judge who doesn't have any commitment or obligation to actually do the right thing. And when they do get told to do the right thing, when they actually do choose to do the right thing, they're committed into a system that doesn't have the beds to house them. So they still end up in jail, they stay in the prison system, they stay in wherever they can be physically held and detained until presumably a bed can be made available. I have personally witnessed the effects of mental illness. I've given you some descriptions. As a legal beagle, I've seen so many cases within the legal system to where people, I've seen their papers, I've talked to them about their cases and their convictions, and so many cases where the person is suffering from mental illness. Their mental illness, they're either manic, they become manic in their mental illness, or they suffer from a delusion, or something else happens, they commit a crime. Instead of recognizing that the crime is a consequence of the mental illness, the court is too ready to punish and not try to actually seek treatment. Not to rehabilitate, but to punish. As I keep saying, Montana is taking full advantage of this flexibility in its own laws. And you can't say that's not deliberate. The idea is, let's put up a moniker, a poster of what we've done to address the challenge of mental illness. And just say, we have risen to the challenge. But in real world application, when you actually have real world attempts to try to adjust these laws into actual real day, everyday events, too many people find ways to live around them because they are so vague and they are so undefined that they make it easy to slip past. And even in the cases to where they are not ill-defined, it simply gives the choice to a court, or, as in the cases I witnessed with Ted Limpus, he deliberately ignored, so he didn't want to have his time wasted. He wasn't going to cater to the whims of this defendant who wanted to waste his time. If they either don't follow the law, or when they do follow the law, they follow it to fit their own agenda and their own desires and their own whims. Because that's what they do. And once again, I say this, and I've said this so many times in recent videos, it's because of lack of citizen oversight. People complain about this stuff all the time, but because they complain to the Judicial Standards Commission in the state of Montana, nothing ever gets done with it because you're not allowed to publicize that you made a complaint to the Judicial Standards Commission. Once you've made it, you basically agreed to a non-disclosure clause. And if you violate the non-disclosure clause, you become the criminal and you get prosecuted. So we have no way of knowing how many times these kinds of abuses get reported. And then the Judicial Standards Commission can just sit on them because it's run by legal professionals whose primary job and duty and their agenda is to protect other lawyers and the judicial system. Remember, mentally ill defendants are easy prey. They rarely have funds for real attorneys. They're easily manipulated, and they often feel persecuted. They're fearful of consequences if they don't follow instructions, they don't comply. And oftentimes these fears are simply a manifestation of their mental disease. They suffer from persecution. The CIA is out to get me, or the aliens are going to come get me, or these guys are lizard men. They're going to come. They're going to eat me in my sleep if I don't do what they want me to do. I've got to try to stay under the radar and not make them angry. So they oftentimes go along with a plea bargain or say whatever it's necessary to say just to try to avoid being hurt through this misperception of harm. Not that all harm is necessarily misperceived, but the degree to which mentally ill people often perceive harm is a completely different level than what you or I may charge. And in all fairness, just as full disclosure, I do suffer from my own elements of mental health. I have anxiety issues, I have claustrophobia, I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. I often say, I don't have OCD, I have CDO. Even the letters have to be in order. Because that's the way it is sometimes. Sometimes I feel so consumed with the need to keep things in order that I have to have everything just lined up. Sometimes I will not start a project because I know if I start the project, I'll be all consumed by the project and getting it all neatly in order. That's the problem with OCD. These do not rise to the level of hallucinations or schizophrenia or bipolar, but they are mental health issues, and they're significant, and they do affect me. I mentioned before, anxiety is a big factor. I'm just doing this script of this podcast that I'm going through anxiety, just because I'm dealing with an issue that raises, my own concerns and my own things I've witnessed and everything else, and then just because. There doesn't have to be a reason for it. I don't always know what the triggers are. I just know I'm suffering from a lot of anxiety. Tonight, I was going through that as I was trying to prepare for this episode. So it's not that I'm talking about people I have no association or no empathy for, because I feel it. I may not feel it to the degree that a lot of people feel it. But nevertheless, there's a reason why mentally ill people need special consideration and why it needs to be a mental health issue and not a criminal justice issue. I said this about drug addiction. Drug addiction imbues in itself its own level of mental illness. And yet it's treated as a crime rather than medical care, because it's become more perceptible for politicians who want to fund the prison for profit system to put people in prison rather than try to deal with them through a far less expensive and far more rehabilitative process. And that's treatment, whether it be for mental illness or drug addiction or alcoholism or anything else. When you face the fear, a very real fear, a very manifest fear of somebody with a mental health issue, that they're going to be killed if they don't do something, they become very compliant. And that's what people in the Great Montana Conspiracy are looking for, people who are easy targets, easy to manipulate, and easy to get into the prison system. Mentally challenged people are just easier even than poor people, because oftentimes they're already poor, and they don't understand what's going on, or their perception of reality is so warped that they can be manipulated into doing whatever the prosecutors and the judges want them to do. The consequence of a nationwide collapse of the mental health system is that corrupt places like Montana can take advantage of disenfranchised citizens like the mentally ill. And their incarceration just becomes another building block to empower the Great Montana Conspiracy. You have a system that is inherently flawed, and it's been flawed since the 1960s. The idea was great. The idea was fantastic. Let's take people out of these isolated areas where nobody can see what's being done to them. Take them out of these literal concentration camps. Let's reintroduce them back into society. Let's make them productive citizens again. And let's humanize mental illness. It was a great concept. It was a great, fantastic idea. It never manifested. The federal government did not live up to their promise. The states took advantage of the public perception of deinstitutionalization and began to actually do it to deinstitutionalize their patients well before there was ever actually a structure to receive them. And then when they did receive the federal funds, and less than half of them actually built facilities to actually use the funds for their intended purpose, they didn't redirect the funds they were no longer using on the state facilities to make up the difference that the federal government didn't do in funding these local community outreach programs. Consequently, they failed. The whole effort failed, but nobody went back to re-examine the safety net that had been completely removed. Now, some efforts have been made over the last 30 years or so to try to raise awareness. NAMI, the National Association of Mentally Ill, is a wonderful advocate for the mentally ill. They're great lobbyists. They do a lot of good work, and I commend them. I've spoken before a NAMI meeting before about my experiences with mental illness within the criminal justice system, within the prison system. I've done my level best to support people in the NAMI program. There are other programs out there that are equally worthwhile. There are lobbyists and advocates, but unfortunately, they're the ones who don't have the money to really stand up to people who actually make money themselves off of things like prison for profit. When you're dealing with a choice between the prison for profit system that pays billions of dollars in federal criminal justice grants to states, and you're dealing with a grossly underfunded program both the federal government and the state governments don't want to fund, the ones with the big money are the ones who went out. It's a defect, and as I said, it's one of the Great Montana Conspiracy and the good old boys take full advantage of. And again, it's been used to change. And it can change with a simple language as citizen oversight. As always, as I wrap this video up, I remind you, if you're watching this on YouTube or any other platform for that matter that allows for it, please take the time to like and subscribe to this video, share it on your social media, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Teach your friends and family to watch it. Tell them the importance and significance of this, especially in this particular episode. If anyone in your family suffers from mental illness, make them aware of how risky and fragile their lives exist if they ever come in contact with the criminal justice system. Because that's exactly what it is. It's a fragile existence. If again, if you don't see this, the text attached to this video, please take the time to go to either conspiracy.podbean.com, which is where this podcast originates, or go to YouTube where the text will appear. As always, please take the time to be safe, and whenever possible, please be free. Thank you.